How did the GM J-body car, like the Chevy Cavalier, go from being what I thought at one time was what was very, very right about General Motors to being the last GM car I would own? Well, I think it's actually a pretty interesting story, so welcome back to All Cars, y'all. It's story time with John, and this is not going to be hard-hitting journalism, expose, recalls, or a history of anything. This is going to be a vlog style of just you and me talking, because a couple of things all came together and I realized in a lot of ways the J-bodies represent most everything that was wrong with GM, and over decades helped lead me away from them. And to understand this, you've got to kind of, first off, let's get into this. And since it's vlog style, we're going to be a little more informal. Grab your beverage of choice. Today we've got some half calf, and I want to introduce a new member of our background over here. That was just gifted to me. So I've got him eating a Fiat 500 right now. You know what? When your family gives you gifts, you put it on display. But a couple of things happened all at the same time. And let's cast our mind back to the early 80s when the J-bodies were introduced. And it's interesting to remember that they were almost a flop when they were released, and went on to be one of the best-selling platforms in all history. And at the time, I was a preteen. I was not driving and really didn't care about cars very much. And my family had a Oldsmobile Custom Cruiser station wagon, one of those really big old station wagons that were popular in the 70s. Huge V8 engine, rear wheel drive. It was quiet and comfortable. And then, of course, a 76 Buick Regal that later went on to be my first car. And when I did start to learn to drive, I mostly practiced in the Regal until it was time to do parallel parking. We did have to do a parallel parking for our driver's exam, and my dad made me take the station wagon to learn in, which helped tremendously. But I also took driver's ed. So remember, we were a GM family, and I was very pro-American. As I've said many times on the channel, we had Buicks and Oldsmobiles. My grandparents on one side had Cadillacs. My grandparents on the other side had Pontiacs. And I looked down on those people who were buying Japanese cars. Why would they be buying these Hondas and Toyotas? We had neighbors who had an Accord, and I was like, whatever, you know. I was a self-righteous little kid. And when I took driver's ed, the car was a Chevy Cavalier, and I remember it very, very clearly, because when you come from that station wagon or a Buick to the Cavalier, I loved it. Tidy dimensions, it felt nimble, it felt fun. I remember the steering wheel was thick. I think that was what it was, and I loved the car. Now, at the time when I was getting ready to get my driver's license, I was beginning to understand how much I could like cars. I desperately craved a 64.5 Mustang convertible, cherry red with a white top. Still would like to have one. And of course, Saab. Somewhere around there, I discovered the Saab 900 Turbo and absolutely fell in love with it. And so I was kind of starting to think about cars like that. And I loved the Cavalier. I just loved it. I remember talking to my parents about it. My mom being like, "We're not buying you a Cavalier. We're not buying you a new car." I'm like, "Okay." And I ended up with a 76 Buick. But I remembered how much I loved that car. And the whole reason I'm doing this video is not just to reminisce. It is a little bit. But I recently did a reaction video to a Pontiac Sunfire. And that was, as far as I remember, my second moment of interacting with a J-body car. And at the time, it was Pontiac. I wasn't a Pontiac. I'm still not much of a Pontiac fan, but I loved that car. I had a acquaintance, a coworker who had one. Who was like, "Go take it for a drive," and he had the turbo in it. And it was a freaking hoot. I loved driving it. And so here you have, early in my driving years, two GM J-bodies at the same time, and I loved both of them. Absolutely adored them. And so why would I look at the Japanese cars? I was happy with what was out there. Our Oldsmobile and our Buick were flawlessly reliable. I was happy. And of course, I went on and I owned a Jeep, and then I owned another Buick, and it was not as good as the previous one. More comfortable in a lot of ways, but the transmission wasn't as strong, and I ended up selling it when it needed its third one. All right. And of course, by the time it was over 100,000 miles, it was dripping oil, I think, from the head gasket, as I recall. And you fast forward a few more years, and I had my second Jeep. We'd moved to another city about 3 hours away, and I had a job where I had a company vehicle. So I sold the Jeep. And we had decided we needed to come back to the Charlotte area because we were driving back every 2 weeks anyway, and I needed a car. And I went to a local used car dealer, and they had two things I was interested in. One, I don't remember the year, but it was a black Volkswagen Passat. And it was, I don't remember the year exactly. I'd have to go look it up. But it was one of the ones where it didn't have a grill. It had like a flat front and no grill, just a big VW symbol. I loved that car. That car was awesome. And I'd had a Volkswagen before, a cheap little Fox. And so I was kind of pro VW. But it was amazing. I loved it. But it had really high miles on it. And for about the same money, there was a Chevy Cavalier. Now, again, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but it was smooth and rounded, and it didn't have a grill on it. And I went back home as an engineer, and I did my research. And what I found was really amazing is that Cavalier tested very, very well against Civics and Corollas and everything else out there. It was a solid small car entry. And so it had the base engine, had I think it's 3-speed, as I recall, automatic, base interior. It was nothing special, but it was affordable. And I decided to get it. And I was happy as I could be for a while. But what I found was while it may have tested well, living with it was substantially less fulfilling than my previous GM cars. And specifically, it was little things, sometimes style things, like the button to on the gear shifter handle was on top, like that. It just felt cheap and chintzy. The materials inside, while they were finally doing big castings of the dashboard, it was the cheapest plastic imaginable. I remember opening the hood and trying to check the oil, and finally figuring out that the dipstick was inside the filler cap, like a lawnmower. And it just tainted my opinion of this car. The more I drove it, the less I appreciated it. It might have accelerated and rode and handled and had the space and the cargo space and everything else to be competitive in the market, but it was eminently unfulfilling. And this was at a time where after I had worked at Saturn, so I have driven Geo Prisms and Toyota Corollas and Honda Civics and just everything we had on the used car lot. And this was just an unfulfilling car. But the thing that killed it for me was the ABS system. Now, GM ABS used to be very, very expensive. I think it was like $1,400 at one point. And it was on, sometimes options. And GM had introduced ABS that was going to be able to be universally used across their lineup, and it was really affordable. I want to say it was like $495 or something like that. I'm sure you'll correct me if I was wrong there. And this car had ABS. They made it standard on a lot of things, but what they did was designed one ABS system that could be used between their smallest car and a Cadillac. And the problem is it didn't work. At least it didn't work properly. If you were on a flat surface and you had a panic stop, it would work. It was crude. It was dun, 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 dun. You could feel it pumping. It was very, very crude, much less refined than others. But more importantly, it was dramatically unsafe, and that's ultimately why I got rid of that other Cavalier. Because if the road was even slightly damp and you were at just a little bit of an incline, the rear brakes would pump, and you would literally roll right into intersections. There was more than once from a light drizzle that I would have to use the emergency brake to stop the car. And it was fine. I had it checked out. Everything was fine. It was working as designed. And so I ended up selling that car because I determined it was just unsafe. And when I talk about on this channel that every GM car I've had was worse than the previous one, this is a great example of they hit the check boxes, right? It's right size, right space, right price, it tested well, but they didn't care about it. Whereas when you drive a Honda or a Toyota of the time, it was fulfilling. Or if you've ever driven something more interesting, it was fulfilling. And the Cavalier absolutely wasn't. I liked it less and less the longer I drove it. And then their ABS system, GM saying, we're going to develop a system and we're going to, through the power of us being able to sell it across hundreds of thousands of cars, we're going to drive that price down. But they ended up with something that was engineering-wise not good. It should have never been on the market, in my humble opinion. I don't hear a lot of people talk about this, but I had firsthand experience, and it was an unsafe design. And so you take this nearly 15 years, let's say, of experience, because we're talking about when I owned this Cavalier, late 90s, maybe into the early 2000s. And you take that time period, and every GM car was less fulfilling and less good than previous ones, even if it could check those boxes, do well in a test. I ended up with that Cavalier being like, GM just doesn't care. They didn't care about the quality of the materials inside. I saw it in advance, but still it wore on me. They didn't care about some of the styling inside. They didn't care about the engineering quality behind it with this ancient engine. And I gave up on GM. So I did this video about the Sunfire, and I talked about some of this to begin with. And one of my commenters said, what was it that made you unhappy with that last Cavalier, And that's what it was. I think I typed an answer to him, but I thought I would elaborate on it a little bit. This is an example to me of what GM was doing from the 80s and into the 90s, of trying to right the ship, trying to produce some decent products. Maybe some of the quality was there, but when I say GM can't do everything right all at the same time, this is a good example. They had a platform that was fine. It rode fine. It handled okay. They didn't really have a great engine in it. They had an old, out-of-date, transmission, no styling inside, poor quality materials, and then I can't get over the ABS. So that's what it was. The J-body started as a car that I desperately liked at the earliest moments of me being able to drive. And by the end there, where I had graduated from college and had a family and realized I could buy better. So thanks for being here for Storytime with John. Let me know your thoughts below and let me know your experience. If you have any other questions about some of this car history stuff that I have, let me know. But I've got some other projects I'm working on, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Thanks, y'all.